I've not come across anything even remotely similar to this story.
That's the voice of Jennifer Jones.
I first found out about Jean-Baptiste when I had moved to Utah and I was looking for spooky stuff.
She has a very well-researched blog and podcast called The Dead History, Giving the Past New Life.
He started pointing out headstones to Jean-Baptiste, asking him, "Did you rob this one? Did you rob this one?"
On this episode of That Doesn't Happen Every Day, in which we talk to everyday people about things that don't normally happen every day, Jennifer takes us to Salt Lake City, back to 1862, to a time of top hats and canes and optimism, and a man who was caught robbing so many graves in the Salt Lake City cemetery that he was banished to a small island out in the Great Salt Lake.
It's actually a really fascinating story, mainly because it's true.
Buckle up, you'll like this one.
This guy, oh my gosh, his life was just nuts.
Before this episode takes us to a small island in the Great Salt Lake, we have to start out on an island continent in the Pacific.
All we really know about Jean-Baptiste before he gets to Utah is that he was in Australia in 1855. And the people that knew him in Australia would later say that he couldn't speak English very well, and they thought that he had come from Italy. Henry Heath would later say, oh, he was totally French. He was a miner. That was what he was doing there. And he was trying to run his own little church. He met some Mormon missionaries, and he just, became obsessed with the religion, converted immediately.
In fact, Baptiste liked these missionaries so much, he invited them into his church and had them preach from his pulpit. Just so we're all on the same page here, the missionaries were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, sometimes still called Mormon, but usually referred to as LDS or Latter-day Saints.
He literally got on the first ship heading to the United States. So he got on this ship called the Tarquinia, and it arrived in Honolulu in 1855. It almost sank on the way there. He eventually got to San Francisco that next year, so about 8 months later. He stayed in California for a few years, and then he made his way in 1859 to Salt Lake.
For quite some time before and after Baptiste arrived in Salt Lake, it had been kind of the gathering place for members of the LDS Church, and that's most likely why he went there as well.
Jean-Baptiste was said to be this short little French guy. People thought he was weird, but then they were kind of like, well, what do you expect? He's a gravedigger. They're obviously just weird to begin with. So in January of 1862, there were two men that were accused of beating Governor Dawson.
Wait, who got beat up?
Governor Dawson.
John Dawson was appointed to be the governor of the Utah Territory by Abraham Lincoln, and according to an article in the Deseret News, Dawson succeeded in upsetting everyone in Utah during his 3 weeks in office. Much of what made him hated were his political decisions, but he was also accused of making a grossly improper proposal to a local widow, and then was accused of offering her money not to talk about it. Incidentally, this 3-week governor would one day go on to write the biography of Johnny Appleseed, who was his childhood friend. After his roughly 20 days in office, Dawson decided to go back to Indiana, but at Mountain Dale, Utah, not far from Salt Lake City, one of that widow's relatives and several other young men dragged Dawson from the stagecoach and beat him within an inch of his life. Some of the attackers were caught right away, but 3 were pursued out to the Salt Lake's Salt Flats, where one of them was shot by famed pioneer Porter Rockwell, and the remaining 2 were arrested and taken to Salt Lake City. However, once in Salt Lake City, they tried to escape, and both were shot to death on 2nd South Street. One of the dead men was named Moroni Clausen, and at first, no one claimed his body.
So when no one from Moroni's family came forward to give him a proper burial, one of the police officers, whose name was Henry Heath, not only paid for this guy's burial, but he purchased a suit for the man to be buried in because, that it wouldn't be respectful, I guess, if he was buried in a naked or in a bag or something. Moroni Clausen was buried, and a little bit later, his brother came forward and asked that they could claim the body, exhume him, and take him to their family plot in Draper. And when his brother exhumed his casket and opened it up, they found out that not only was Clausen buried face down, but he was completely naked.
Quick note, most of us would think it's a little weird to open a coffin after it's been buried, but there's a strong likelihood that Moroni's brother wanted to see Moroni one last time, and maybe he also felt a need to verify that he had the right grave.
And so Moroni's brother was, seriously upset, rightfully so, because he's thinking, not only did the cops kill my brother, but then they disrespected him by burying him upside down and naked. Clausen's brother ended up going over to Officer Heath and was really upset. And Heath was adamant that that was not how they had buried his brother. He explained to him, look, I paid for his casket. I even went and bought him a new suit. This is not how he was buried. And so they went to the cemetery. They met with one of the sextons.
A sexton is someone who looks after a cemetery or a church, and this particular sexton told them to talk to John Baptiste.
So first they went to his house because they didn't see him. So they go to his house and his wife comes to the door. And I feel really bad for his wife because not only was she dealing with this guy stuck married to him, but then the newspaper basically said that she was simple-minded. So they go to his house. His wife says, he's not here. He's at the cemetery. And as they were talking to her in the doorway, they could just see all these moldering piles of clothing, and the house was a mess and it smelled. And so they were like, that's really weird.
John DeVitri Smith's paper about the event makes a citation saying the house had a motley, sickening heap of fresh soiled linen and funeral shrouds.
They go and they find Jean-Baptiste at the cemetery, and they accused him of robbing the graves. And as soon as they accused him of being a grave robber, Jean-Baptiste is said to have fallen to his knees and just began begging for his life. At this point, Heath is almost probably madder than Moroni Clausen's brother. He started pointing out headstones to Jean-Baptiste, asking him, did you rob this one? Did you rob this one? And Jean-Baptiste just kept saying yes to all the ones that he was asking about.
It was there, on the likely snowy ground of the Salt Lake City Cemetery, that Officer Henry Heath turned to the nearby grave of Sarah Heath. Sarah Heath had been Henry's 9-year-old daughter, and she had been interred there a little less than a year before after she had died of an illness. Officer Heath gestured to the grave of his child and said,
did you rob this one? And Jean-Baptiste says, no, I didn't do that one. And Heath would later say that had Jean-Baptiste admitted or, claimed to have robbed his daughter's grave, he probably would have killed him right there on the spot. I did visit Henry Heath's grave and that of his daughter. She's kind of buried on a little hill. It's kind of crazy when you go to a place and you research this story and these men were standing right next to this grave, having an argument.
I asked Jennifer if they dug up all of the graves that Baptiste admitted to robbing.
If I remember correctly, they dug up a few because they wanted to, make sure that he wasn't lying. One of the things that really upset the townsfolk the most was that he did not discriminate on what type of grave he dug up. He would dig up babies, little kids, old people. He didn't care.
The DeVitri Smith article even said that Baptiste's house was found to have a large box with infants' clothing and about 60 pairs of children's shoes. Clothing for adults was also found.
And apparently he just liked to hoard their clothes and their jewelry and stuff. He never pawned anything, jewels or anything that was valuable. He just hoarded everything. So he definitely had some stuff going on upstairs. And they take him to the Salt Lake City jail. They are pretty much guarding him to save his life, because once word got out, people were so mad. They were afraid they were going to just go in there and yank him out of the jail.
I think it's fair for anybody to be angry if this had happened to their loved ones. However, one other thing I hadn't considered when I'd heard this story before is that in the late 1860s, and even today, many members of the LDS Church are purposely buried in clothing normally worn in LDS temples. The LDS Church does not believe that doing this is essential for people to be saved or anything like that. It's almost more of kind of a symbolic gesture. However, back in 1862, when the LDS Church had only been around for about 30 years and many of its members had been through a lot, some of them were even worried that if that temple clothing had been stolen from the bodies of their loved ones, it might have some sort of impact on their salvation. Brigham Young, who was president of the LDS Church at the time, spoke out soon after the crimes were discovered. Many are anxious to know what effect it will have upon their dead who have been robbed. We have done our duty in this particular, meaning specially dressing the dead for burial, and I, for one, am satisfied. The saints will come forth with all the glory, beauty, and excellence of the resurrected saints, clothed as they were when they were laid away. Some may inquire whether it is necessary to put fresh linen into the coffins of those who have been robbed. I promise you that they will be clothed in the resurrection. I would let my friends lay and sleep in peace. Basically, it sounds like he felt people had done their due diligence in caring for their dead, and it was time to move forward. I really like that Brigham Young went out of his way to try to reassure people that had experienced one more insult to their way of life and what they held sacred, that their relatives were okay and they didn't have to do anything more. Some might argue that perhaps Baptiste was engaged in some profane hate crime against LDS people or their beliefs, but given that he himself had been baptized into the LDS Church and just how bizarre his crime was, I think, like Jennifer said, he was probably just out of his mind.
They went to his house. They removed all of the clothes and items that he had stolen out of, the coffins that he robbed, and put them on display at the Salt Lake City courthouse for people to come through and, if they could identify any of the pieces, they could claim them. The items that were not claimed were later buried in a mass grave in the city cemetery. The people of Salt Lake City were super mad. They were demanding that Baptiste be brought to justice.
Brigham Young also weighed in on his thoughts about Baptiste. To hang a man for such a deed would not begin to satisfy my feelings. What should we do with him? Shoot him? No, that would do no good to anybody but himself. Would you imprison him during life? That would do nobody any good. If it was left to me, I would make him a fugitive and a vagabond upon the earth. Jennifer said she couldn't find any court transcripts for Baptiste, but there is information on what was finally done to the grave robber of Salt Lake City.
That following spring, in 1862, he was taken by wagon to Antelope Island and then by boat to Fremont Island. They took Jean-Baptiste to the island and they set him free.
Fremont Island is only about 11 square miles, and perhaps if it was in the Pacific and had lots of coconut trees, fishing, nice beaches, it wouldn't be that bad of a prison, at least for a while. But I've linked some pictures in the description, and while views from it aren't bad, you see the Salt Lake, the other islands, the surrounding mountains. It's mostly shrubs and open land. I wouldn't want to be there in the winter.
Antelope Island at the time and Fremont Island were used by the Miller family to graze cattle. And so on Fremont Island, even though it was really small and barren, they had a small shack that they kept stocked with basic provisions. The brothers who kept their cattle out there, they would go out to the island every 3 weeks or so just to check on, their cattle. So they had checked on him, he'd been doing well. They would see him, walking around when they would check on their cattle. And then a month or so later, they go to check on him and he's nowhere to be found. And not only is he nowhere to be found, but the shack has been basically demolished. And they found one of their cattle had been killed and a huge piece of its leather was missing. And so they theorized that he built a raft with the wood from the shack and this leather and escaped.
And looking at Google Earth, it appears that Fremont Island is only a few miles from the eastern shore of the Great Salt Lake. To be fair, that's according to current water levels. As best as I can tell, they were higher when Baptiste was there. Today, if the water is low enough, you can even access the island by a muddy sandbar. The Utah Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands webpage that talks about visiting Fremont Island says, "Warning, visiting Fremont Island is a serious undertaking and potentially dangerous." I actually think it's kind of cool that there's still this element of foreboding about going out there. And if you do plan to go out there, I will include links to that department's webpage so you can see what kind of precautions you should take and what the rules are.
And that's where any known information about Jean-Baptiste just completely stops. There were rumors that the word grave robber was tattooed on his forehead or burned into his forehead. It wouldn't surprise me if he had been, but you would think if he had escaped from the island, somebody would notice, like, oh, there's a dude walking around that we've never seen before with grave robber, tattooed on his forehead. People would talk about it, obviously, for years after that.
About 30 years after Baptiste's disappearance, a group of duck hunters found something sticking out of the mud at the mouth of Utah's Jordan River, only about 60 miles south of where Baptiste was last seen.
They found a partial skeleton missing its head with a ball and chain around its leg. And so for a long time, people said, that was Jean-Baptiste. Henry Heath, the officer that arrested Jean-Baptiste, later gave an interview and said that Baptiste was not shackled in any way and that he did not have a ball and chain. So a body for him has never been found. But like I said, nothing else for him has ever been found either.
Did Brigham Young get his wish? Was Baptiste doomed to be just a fugitive and vagabond upon the earth till he did finally die somewhere? If you did have grave robber or anything to that effect written on your forehead, it would probably be a good idea to move back to France or Italy or wherever you came from, where back then especially, most people didn't speak or read English. Some people say Baptiste was actually from Venice, Italy. The first time I ever got to go to Venice was, ironically, when I was a Mormon missionary. And I wonder if me or any of the guys with me talked to or maybe even shook hands with one of his distant relatives, or if he ever did go back to Italy, perhaps one of his descendants.
I think he survived probably for a while. The crazy ones always seem to do that, so.
There are also accounts of people saying they still see him walking on the shore of the Salt Lake, not far from Fremont Island. I would like to thank Jennifer Jones so much for being on the show today. I encourage everybody to please go to her blog and also check out her podcast called The Dead History. You'll have a lot of fun, and I hope Jennifer likes this episode enough that she'll come back on the show again. All of the sources that I know of that were cited in this episode are also linked in the description if you'd like to check them out. If you'd like to visit Fremont Island, again, please visit the Utah Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands webpage that I've listed in the description so that you can go properly equipped and have a safe and fun trip. If you're enjoying this show and would like to contribute to it, please click on the little heart icon or go to PayPal and send any amount you think is good to @doesn't-happen-every-day. All one word, all lowercase, no apostrophe. Please also check out the show on KHOL in Jackson. It plays every Wednesday. You can listen to every episode I've ever done by simply doing a search for That Doesn't Happen Every Day. Every day is 2 words in this case, podcast, and all the shows are archived and available for free. Thank you for listening. I hope to have a new episode to you in about 2 weeks.